Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Lydia Smith. You might know her from Tim Pool's production. She's actually a producer of Tim Pool's nightly podcast or webcast or live stream. Don't know exactly what they consider themselves doing up there in Washington, D.C. almost every night of the week. But she's been working with Tim for quite some time, and she contacted me about some things, and I'm like, well, why don't you come onto my channel and let me ask you questions and see who you actually are? And she was taken aback, it seemed, because she hadn't been asked that before. By the time that she got on my channel, she has been on somebody else's. But here she is in all of her glory. We get to understand how she views the world, which is basically pretty darn conservative. It's great to listen to conservative women and also liberal women and other interviews and kind of just get the mapping of how different women think about the world differently. You wouldn't think that they would do that from certain rhetoric that you find online and very low resolution versions of what it is to represent females in various pop culture and activist circles. So Lydia's got her own view of things, and I appreciate her coming on my channel and giving me a bit of her spirit to bottle up and then to pass out to you. So without further ado, here's Lydia Smith. Okay. This is just going to be freewheeling.
Sure.
Get the scoop on lids.
There's not a lot to scoop, but I do like to talk. So.
Well, where'd you?
I said no, not really.
Okay. Where did you get your start then?
I was actually plucked from a strange profession. I used to work in a hospital. I was an EKG tech, so I worked in a cardiovascular unit, and I watched hearts beat all day, which I thought was interesting. I was actually in school to become a surgical tech, so I still really like science, anatomy, biology, and all that kind of stuff. But Tim befriended me on Instagram, and I was like, this is really cool because I love reading the news. And I was like, I'm already reading the news. I'll just send him the things that I find interesting. And that's what I did, and he made use of a lot of those articles, and we went from there. He's like, hey, I'm going to start this new podcast. Do you want to produce it? I was like, that sounds great. So I moved across the country, and here I am.
Oh, wow. So you originated from the West Coast.
Yeah, so I'm actually from Colorado, so right smack dab in the middle there, whatever that's considered, because that's not Midwest. And that's
it's mountain time.
It is, exactly. So I do miss kind of like our big mountains, but we have pretty cool mountains here in Maryland as well, so I don't miss it too bad.
How did you end up adapting to production work?
It took a lot of trial and error. Like what you're saying about what were you do being iterative was definitely the case, especially for us, because I know Tim knows what he's doing, but doing this kind of podcast was a first for us, both of us. And he had to teach me like how to use different programs, and he had to teach me how to make the clips and how to make the thumbnails, and all of that was kind of trial and error a little bit when we were starting for both of us. But he is a really good, he's a good source of wisdom, and he knows exactly what he's doing. So I just take his advice, and he's a useful sounding board. So
you guys do the, that refers to the technical aspect, but you also do curatorial. How do you end up choosing what you guys are going to talk about or explore? Is there like a
usually
shape?
What we'll do? Yeah, so Tim actually has a really strong structure for the show that people don't seem to really realize until they're in studio with us. And then they say that it's a little bit like, almost like a TV show, because we have stories that we go throughout the day. And I pull them up on the computer a little bit before the show, and I say, this looks interesting, and he'll go through and he'll close whatever he doesn't really want to talk about, but he'll be like, oh yeah, that's a great story, we'll cover that. So he guides the conversation in such a way that we are able to come up with like segments. So we'll have like a period of time where we're talking about what's going on, for example, in Seattle, and we'll talk about what's happening with defund the police there, and then that can kind of bleed over into our next topic, which is some other city or some other affair or some other conversation. And he tries really hard to make it like a clear boundary between the different topics so that the next day we can put them into like these shorter video clips that I then upload to YouTube. So he's very structured, and he's always guiding the conversation. So that's really, really good.
What was it like stepping in front of the camera? How did you end up there?
So he was like, I didn't really want a camera, but Tim was like, like it or not, being a girl is a little bit of a draw. I was like, okay, that's kind of interesting. I do want to be helpful to the show. So if I can kind of contribute to viewership in any way, I'll do what I can do. So we finally got a camera for me a couple months into the show. And it was a little bit unsettling at first because I had no idea how I would look. Like, it was very much like an insecurity thing. I was just like, I don't know how it's going to be for me to be on the screen. But it was fine, and he made it very natural, and he's like, I really do want you to jump in if you feel like you have something really important to add. And I was like, okay, that sounds like a great combination. Like, I don't have to be on the screen all the time. Because like I was telling Chrissy, I don't think I could keep a conversation going for like 2 hours straight. That's not my forte. I mean, I do like to talk, but not for that long, So yeah, it was hard at first, but I've kind of gotten used to it. I'm sure I still have fidgety tics that are probably going to bother people if I'm on camera for too long. But yeah, I don't worry too much about it. I've gotten a lot more comfortable, so it's good.
What is the topics that you get into most?
I love philosophy because I've had people ask me, what's the purpose of philosophy? And they're like, I never think about it. I don't think it's a big deal. I think it's kind of esoteric. And I'm like, you just don't know what your philosophy is. Like, literally thinking that philosophy is not a big deal is kind of a life philosophy. So people just don't realize how crucial these underlying tenets are. And I was listening to Ben Shapiro talking to Russell Brand yesterday. And that was a really interesting conversation because those are two guys you wouldn't put in the same room most of the time. But Russell and Ben were reaching the conclusion that we need to get down to some of these underlying aspects of society and culture that are kind of overlooked. Like when we argue about gun control, we don't really look at the actual issues that are way underneath all that stuff. And at that, I do think that's the best place to start. I don't think you can have a conversation about abortion without figuring out what's going on under the surface. So I love philosophy. I love culture. I like to talk about these trends that I see. And it is very interesting to me. Tim gets kind of a bad rap a little bit for talking a lot about a coming civil war. And I'm a little bit more white-pilled than he is, because I do think that there are solutions that we can enforce. And I'm not convinced that the status quo isn't something that will show people how bad democratic ideas are. So I think that there will be an awakening for a lot of these people. But that's of great interest to me as well, like kind of this idea of whether we can restore a union.
You mentioned democratic ideas. Are you talking about like the current slate of progressive ideas?
Yeah, like progressive ideas, liberal leftist ideas.
When did you first become aware of them in the current manifestation, and how has your idea of them shifted and to be what it is now?
So I remember where I was when it happened. We had 5 acres and I was out. I was walking around the back of our property when it was nice and sunny. It was breezy. And it occurred to me that feminism and the fat acceptance movement was actively hurting women, because if you truly cared about women, you would want them to live a longer and happier life. And that means not being heavily obese. And I think I was about 10 or 11 years old, because I mentioned this sometimes. I wrote my first letter to the editor of our local newspaper when I was about 11, because I was reading the news and I was like, this is strange. I think this is about, I don't even remember what the topic was, but I was like, I have to let them know what I think of this. So I did, and I actually got published in the newspaper, and I was like, wow, I'm so great at writing. I'm paying attention to the current events. And then I quickly realized that I was too conservative to work in journalism. I was like, I'll never be happy in this field. No one's ever going to accept my ideas in this field. So I need to find a different thing to do, which is how I ended up doing, working in a hospital and working with science and stuff. But that was the first time I remember thinking about that, was probably when I was about 10 or 11. It has evolved somewhat since then. I still believe that the fat acceptance movement is a generally bad idea. And as someone who has recently gained weight because they put me on steroids and it just never went away, I've been like, okay, so I'm hoping to be able to use my journey with that actual struggling with weight and stuff as an American, to be able to positively affect the people who now kind of look up to me in some small way. So I'm hoping to be able to use my position to be positive for those people.
That's a really interesting frame there. You say your state as an American, not as a woman, because you could easily make this a woman's issue, but you would rather start at the American or the cultural level.
Yeah. I view everything in terms pretty much of the culture, because the culture has failed males and females in different ways, but it has failed us all pretty much to this. Well, I wouldn't even say to the same degree, because men are failed by like the justice system and women are failed by feminism in general. And in the fact that we've doubled our workforce and now we have problems with like having a household where you only need one income. But yes, it affects all of us, and you can break it down to what affects, the fact that the justice system sides with women over men, sides with mothers over fathers, and the fact that we now need those two incomes if you're in a relationship, and women have to work. But yeah, at every level, Americans have kind of been failed and now need to figure out what to do about it, and that's on all of us, unfortunately.
No, I mean it's a call to action. It's an opportunity for us to kind of reinvent ourselves, and there's a necessary pressure now that the without a moral foundation, it's going to be imposed, and it seems like certain elements of the progressive left are really gunning to impose a certain morality.
Yep. And I've been really, I don't know about you, but I've been super encouraged by all these videos of these parents pushing back. These parents at their school board meetings. And I was even watching a video of a little 9-year-old girl. I was listening to Louder with Crowder, and they pulled up this video of this little girl who, very articulate, she's explaining why she doesn't like the Black Lives Matter poster at her school. She's like, you said that we couldn't have any kind of political activism, but here you are. This is exactly what you're doing. I know what Black Lives Matter is. I know that you guys are being hypocrites here. So can you fix this, or are we going to have, issue? And I was like, that is awesome to see people really figuring out how they're going to come to terms with this, because we used to get that question all the time on the show. How am I supposed to fight back? What am I supposed to do? So on the upside of all this nonsense, I think that people are figuring out what exactly they can do, and they're starting to realize that there are steps they can take, and they're taking them. So I'm encouraged on that level. That's why I say I'm more white-pilled than Timmons.
Mm-hmm. This is a concern of mine, that without a positive set of values, reacting against the values that we don't like will only go so far. We can stand up and fight this stuff and be like the problem with the anti-woke movement is that it's not necessarily promoting something solid other than this kind of hazy version of liberalism or classical liberalism. And then there's this idea of conservatism, but we don't really know what it is. What is it made out of? So with that in mind, where are you coming from? Because it seems like you already knew at a very early age that you were too conservative. So there's some sort of building blocks that you were starting from.
Yeah, so I was starting from the foundation of having a very religious family, which I think is something that our culture is abundantly clearly missing. And it's a huge issue for us. We thought that we could get away with having no religion. We thought we could get away with not teaching history. These things, hugely untrue. And we're starting to see the results of that. We are ungrateful. We are unmoored. We have no faith. We have no structure. The Judeo-Christian structure is hugely important in ways that we do not fully comprehend because we take it for granted. So because we don't teach religion and because we don't teach any kind of history, now we have this lack of gratitude and we have this completely freewheeling. We're very much loose cannons. And I credit my parents very much for raising myself and my siblings in such a way that we had at least a very solid foundation of understanding other humans. Whatever each of us ends up thinking about God, most of my siblings are still very much involved in the church. My sister's raising her 3 little kids in the church, and that's really I think that's really necessary because the church gives that community and it gives that structure that people now are missing. Because we hear people talk about how lonely they are, and that makes me really sad. That really breaks my heart. And I see it as being a problem as well, because we have a social media and it has made us so atomized and so lonely. It used to be that you had to go out into your community to make friends, and sometimes you disagree with your friends, and that would be okay. You were still friends with them, even though you didn't see eye to eye on whatever, the tax system or something. But now you can go onto the internet and you can find a group of people who literally agree with you on everything. You can find a group that caters to your strangest fantasy and your weirdest whim and your oddest sexual preference, and that's considered now normal. No one is allowed to criticize that. So I see that as being a huge issue and a reason for the division that we have and a lot of that loneliness. But you mentioned that conservatism kind of lacks a positive force. And that's something that I've observed and that really troubles me as well, because it's true that we do lack a positive force. I forget who originally said this, but conservatives have a reputation for standing athwart history yelling stop. And Michael Malice calls conservatives, liberals driving the speed limit, liberalism driving the speed limit. And I think that's 100% true. All we're doing is saying no, no, no. Okay, maybe a little compromise until eventually we are, for example, embracing gay marriage and we're engaging with trans people, which I still have conflicted feelings about, because it actually is a slippery slope. And I would like to include everyone in the conservative movement, because I do believe that conservative is in fact good for everyone. But I don't know how accepting it is wise to be, because conservatives have always been about boundaries and rules, and that's a personality thing as well as a political preference. But they understand the necessity of having these important structures. Like, I think that's part of the reason that they tend to be more religious as well, because you need boundaries and you need to be able to say no, but that's not all we can do. We have to do more. And that's why I think that religion really needs to make that strong comeback, because that would be a good positive structure to say, look, you can have a strong family, you can have a strong community, but you need to be involved in your church. Sorry. Pick whatever church you want. You need to build that community there. You need to have people who will look after your kids and people who will look after you when you're sick, who will bring you meals after you have a child or whatever. And all those little things that churches did that we kind of took for granted and then just kind of shunted to the side when we felt like we were progressed past that. And now it turns out that we're actually not. And maybe we really need that community. So I think that would be one of the positive things that conservatives could bring to the table, but we need to get religion back into the forefront.
There is something you said about no matter what we think about God, we have a conception of the human being. So if we just start with the conception of the human being, maybe we can work out what is tolerable and intolerable about human behavior. So what is this? Is there a unifying version or vision of the human that we can start with?
I think so, because if you look at all these different cultures, pretty much universally, it is understood that something like murder is negative, obviously. There have been exceptions. There are religious ceremonies. For example, the Aztecs and the Mayans really took human life for granted. And we currently take human life for granted as well. But generally speaking, murder is understood to be bad. Marriage is understood to be good, to be a positive force in the culture, and to be revered. Old people are to be respected because they know what they've seen different things, and they have wisdom that younger people don't have. So I do believe that there are enough underlying commonalities between cultures to kind of be able to develop a strong moral sense of what is good for humans, and thus what is good for cultures. And those things include not being sexually promiscuous. They include what Jordan Peterson called culturally enforced monogamy. I love the idea of cultural enforcement because it completely removes government from the picture. The issue with it is that our culture is so atomized and so broken down without any form of religion that the cultural enforcement we see right now is such negative peer pressure. This is what our parents used to tell us about, don't just go along with the crowd. If the crowd is doing things like getting married and establishing their own family and going to church, paying their taxes and being responsible human beings, that is wonderful peer pressure. Peer pressure in itself is not a net negative if the culture around you is doing the right things. So I really think that if we could reform the culture, this is the conclusion I've had to reach with abortion, because I'm strongly pro-life in almost every instance. And I've finally had to reach the conclusion that abortion is a cultural issue that cannot be solved from the top down. I would like for it to be illegal, but at the same time, I also understand that that prohibition doesn't make problems go away, basically. It didn't work with hard drugs. It definitely did not work with alcohol. So banning something outright may not be the right solution. So what would be better would be changing the culture that encourages girls to sleep around, that encourages people to be promiscuous, and encourages fathers to leave. And I saw a meme the other day about how, if you're going to make abortion illegal, then you should make it illegal for men to leave women too. And somebody commented, "Congratulations, you just invented marriage." Like, yes, that's what it used to be. It used to be that if your girlfriend got pregnant, surprise, you're going to be married next week. And whether that made people happy or not, this is something that was a cultural imperative that people understood. There was an understanding that if you were going to be promiscuous, you're going to find yourself saddled with the responsibility for, the effects of your irresponsibility. So it's just such a cultural force. And I think that I'm not sure how to change a culture, except I really think that Tim has the right mindset and the right approach of making these things cool. We want to make it cool to be conservative or to have these classical liberal ideas. We really want kids to look at what we're doing, and that's why they're having fun on the weekends. That's why they're doing the vlog and they're going out, they're skating. He thinks that's really important. Getting kids physically active, I think, is wonderful as well. But he's like, I just want the Gadsden flag to be in the background. And that way, when a kid's teacher says to them, "This is a racist flag, you should be suspended for having this on your backpack," they can say, "Are you crazy? I know that's not racist because, this half Asian guy has it in his barn while he's doing his skating tricks. I've seen it before. It's not racist. It's clearly not. And in fact, I've done my own homework and I know where it comes from and I know what it's about. It's just from the U.S. Navy. So you're wrong. It's not racist. In fact, what else are you lying to me about if that's something that you're telling me right now?" So okay, I love the idea of kind of planting these seeds and making it, first of all, helping people understand that there are people who think like them, because it is easy to look at Twitter. Twitter's exceedingly leftist and say, "I'm alone." So I like the idea that every night on our show, we get together a huge group of people who really like what we have to say. And they talk with each other. Like, the chat is constantly flying. I think it's great. People are silly in the chat, and their comments are kind of dumb and trite, but at least there are other people who kind of think along the same wavelength that they do, and they disagree on plenty of stuff. But as far as I can tell, it's kind of getting people back to being friends with people in real life. Because then you're like, well, I disagree with you on this, this, and this, but we agree on the big things. That's not a big deal. And I think that's exactly where we need to return to. So I think that stuff like Steven Crowder's show and stuff like our show and some other right-leaning commentators kind of building community, the Daily Wire is a good example of that, is absolutely crucial. We need to make it cool to be conservative again, countercultural.
Growing up as a Gen Xer and watching movies, I was, I became aware that stories involving judgment or social judgment was usually embedded as the social judgment was keeping people back. And it was usually from a conservative point of view, oppressing or suppressing people's true authentic self. It's just like kind of a story over and over and over again. But that judgment isn't embedded if you just watch Hollywood for the last 30 years, you would think that the judgment's embedded in the church. But the judgment is a part of human nature. And without the church, it's still there. It's called cancel culture. So what is judgment pushing us toward? Is it pushing us towards a more stable society? Or is it pushing us into more and more incredibly atomized, kind of individualist collectivism in this weird identitarian kind of place where you can't ever judge anybody. That's their identity, and they can change their identity this way and that way. And everybody's looking for meaning. Everybody's looking for a community, and those boundaries are still very enforced. The judgment's still very much there, but what is it creating? So I think I see what you're saying, and the way that we would judge whether the judgment is serving a good society or towards a bad society is just judging how stable that society is, how productive, stable, and the net happiness that it's providing human life.
Absolutely. I think you're 100% right. I have heard it said, I'm going to use the example of money. I've heard it said that money is a marker of character. It's neutral in itself, but given to a good man, like Tim, he'll do good things with it. Given to a bad man, like George Soros, he will do bad things with it. It's just a tool. Judgment, I think, is very much the same way. And I think that judgment is necessary. So that leads over a little bit into the conversation about shame, because modern American culture says that shame is always bad. There's a reason that people feel shame. There's obviously some utility to it. There's a time and a place when you should feel ashamed, and that is when you've done something that's genuinely wrong. Feeling ashamed shows you that you need to apologize for something or that you need to change the way you do things. And in that way, it's incredibly useful. It's a little bit like when you have a fever. You have a fever for a reason. Your body is trying to fight an infection. So when you feel a sense of shame, it's not something to shun immediately. It's something to analyze. It's something to be conscious of in yourself. And one of the things that I have a friend, coworker, who I converse about with this stuff pretty frequently. And we were talking about the idea of judgment and how unself-aware people are. I think, and he agrees, that most people are so incredibly unaware of what they want and what they need and what is good for them, because we've been told that we're perfect just the way we are, which is incredibly depressing if you think about it. And so we just kind of assume that whatever we want is fine. Whatever we want to do is perfect and exactly what we should be moving toward. But this is not the case. And that, again, circles back to the concept of not having that structure, not knowing, should I have kids? Should I have a family? Should I get married? Yes, you should. You shouldn't just be floating around trying to do what makes you happy. You're not going to find a deep sense of fulfillment. Viktor Frankl says that when people are very, unmoored, they just look for distraction. And as far as I'm concerned, happiness is a distraction. It is not fulfilling. So we absolutely do need that strong negative push of cultural judgment and this feeling of shame to keep people on the right track. Like, it's a little bit like the carrot and the stick. You need a stick as well as a carrot. We've had nothing but carrots lately, so it's really effective. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one thing that I've been considering or trying to put out there, because I'm trying to get a better understanding of core conservative principles beyond just saying no or just the brake pedal of culture. Like, what are the foundational values, let's just say, of American society? But one thing about conservatives writ large on a personality level, if we kind of go and take something from Jonathan Haidt about the different political people end up in different political zones because of their personality more than those zones are right or wrong. It's just that's where they gravitate toward. How do you make conservatism beyond cool, beyond sexy? I think the root of it would be playful.
Yes.
How does conservatism be playful? And if we can be playful, or if they can be playful, then the art can flow, and then the art can inspire culture. So do you have any sense of where conservatism gets stodgy or doesn't kind of loses the touch with that playfulness, and how do you keep that alive?
That's a great question, and not one I've really thought about deeply. But I will say, I do think that making conservatism attractive will go hand in hand with making it more playful. Because in order to make it attractive, you need to make it interesting. You need to make people curious about it. And you need to have, obviously, that positive, because it has been so negative for so long. And while I will laud the importance of shame, there's a lot to be said for having the proper balance between shame and reward. And I think that conservatism has been sadly heavy-handed with the negativity for far too long. So I just think that by turning it a little bit, we can make it more positive. I think that people are starting to notice, because this is something I commented about with Chrissy as well. I saw on this really big meme page on Instagram, I saw this really fun, cute little video that showed at the start of your relationship, it's just a couple. And then it goes further on into your relationship, and it's this couple and their cute little kid, and they're dancing like they did, when they first got together. And I was like, that is fascinating to me, because I view memes very much as like taking the pulse of a culture. I love memes, don't get me wrong. I think they're hilarious and wonderful. But it's a little bit like reading graffiti to see what people really are thinking about. And I don't know if it's because the people who make memes are aging at about the same rate I am, and they're reaching some similar conclusions I am. But it really appears to me that families are becoming more interesting. Like, it's becoming very cool to have a kid. Like, it's exciting. Like, you see these videos of these dads playing with their kids, and you're like, wow, that looks like a lot of fun. It seems great to be a dad. And believe it or not, I think that memes are actually a really important place that conservatives are winning. Because they are good at memes.
Okay, wait.
It's great. It's funny.
Help me crack this nut then. Why? What is it about memes that conservatives have a proclivity for?
That is a really interesting question. I don't know. Have you seen the meme that leftists can't meme?
Yeah. That's an age-old meme at this point.
So true. It is so true, because leftists can't laugh at themselves. Leftists, I think, take themselves far too seriously. Everything is an affront. Everything is, disturbing and scary and
threatening.
They lack a sense of humor, and maybe that's tied to their lack of introspection. That's kind of what I've concluded on. Or
that. Stability, in a sense. If conservatives are rooted in responsibility, then they can start to laugh because they know where their anchor is. If you don't have an anchor, then any sort of humor destabilizes you on a very fundamental level.
That's a great point. I used to kind of counsel other people when we were first going online, and there was all this mocking, and people would be afraid of being bullied, and I would say, if you know the truth about yourself, it doesn't matter what user XYZ123 on Twitter has to say about you, because they don't know the truth about you like you do. So knowing yourself and knowing, for example, that you're not ugly or that you're not stupid is really helpful. So I do think that ties directly into being self-aware. I think that conservatives are self-aware enough to be able to laugh at themselves. They know their weaknesses. And there is a lot of tribalism that I really hate to see on the right, but they're more willing to assess their own shortcomings and accept their own mistakes and bicker among themselves. For whatever reason, they have that stronger, I think it is just because they have a stronger grounding than leftists do. I think that's what makes the right better at memeing and better at humor in general, because if you've been watching comedy, like these late night shows, just insufferable. Samantha, oh my gosh.
I don't know where they went wrong, but
what happened? It was sometime, I think it was when they started uncritically singing Obama's praise, because that really weakened them. Like, it took them out of practice of telling jokes. And then they were just like, oh, well, we'll just use the president forever. And then they used Trump. And now Biden's such a non-person that I feel like they're still stuck on Trump, because he was just generally so much more interesting than Biden. But yeah, the left comedy is really falling apart. And I think the right is really rising with people like Ryan Long. We got people like Dave on Steven Crowder's show. We have Steven Crowder, whatever people think of him. He's worked really hard to be in that space of like a late night host for conservatives. And it's been fun to watch him grow and expand. I wish he'd expand even more, kind of like have the same vision that Tim has, but they're doing a good thing as well, and I won't criticize them for that. But I do think that the right wins with memes because we're able to laugh at ourselves, and having a sense of humor is attractive. So I think in some ways conservatism is really attractive on its own. It does give you the freedom to live your own life. Like liberty itself, I would say, is probably the strongest positive attribute of conservatism because people want to be free.
Which is different than liberation, which is the progressive sense of kind of freeing themselves from oppression and then making more oppressions to be free from. Rather, liberty is that I have responsibility, I have my plot of land, my property, whatever that is, I have a starting point and a base to rest my feet. And with that in mind, I can be free, kind of like, I guess, like a tree rather than just a tumbleweed.
That's a great comparison. I really like that, actually, because it is true that Jesus used the parable of building your house on sand. And I view that as very much being what the left wing has done. I think that the strongest tenet, the most noticeable thread that runs through the left right now is this concept of oppression and power, these power dynamics. So it is always so interesting to me in examining the left's philosophy to look at how much they're projecting. And I think it's a just human thing, you know, because I really feel like everyone always projects. And it was interesting to me because I tweeted about that and I said, everyone always projects. And people are like, so are you projecting? And I was like, absolutely. Because as I just said, everyone always projects. And because I think that people always project because you can only look at the world through your own eyes, right? That means you're going to ascribe to me feelings that you would have in my situation. And that's fine. That's part of the human experience. But what the left does, because they're so like hive mind, I think what they do is every time they notice something is off, because they don't ever take responsibility for anything, I think that they start to project because they see problems. For example, I'll use example of feminism. Have you heard the restart the clock meme with feminist men?
No.
So every time a male feminist is accused of assaulting a woman in some horribly inappropriate way, they say reset the clock. And it happens constantly. And I'm like, you know what? Feminists are right to dislike the men that they hang out with. Because the men that they hang out with are terrible. Not all men are like that. It just happens to be men who hang out with feminists. They're not good men. And I'm like, that's so simple. And I wonder if they'll ever figure that out. Because the type of male who is associating with a feminist is typically doing so, obviously, in hopes of reproducing, which is fine. Again, that's a human thing to do. But the things that he will do to get there are dishonorable, they are in poor character, and they turn him into the kind of person that he probably doesn't even really want to be himself, all for the sake of getting laid. So when you look at the left accusing the right of doing X, Y, and Z, for example, right now they are saying that Republicans wish to defund the police, because Republicans chose not to give medals to Capitol Police or something about the Capitol Police. This is their strongest comparison right now. They are trying to say that conservatives wish to defund police. And to me, it's like glaringly obvious they're projecting at this point, because it gets kind of mushy in there because there's so much of the power dynamic. When they're constantly talking about power and oppression, it's hard to see that they're the ones doing the oppressing. And to me, it makes sense that they would be blind to that, because it is challenging. Like, so much of life is very challenging and people are just not up to properly analyzing it. It takes a lot of thought. Like, I don't even really blame most people for not deeply analyzing this stuff, because it is a lot to deal with. But if you were to sit down and say, why do I always think that conservatives are oppressing other people, you might, if you were fully honest, be forced to the conclusion that you yourself were oppressive in some way. I think that they're afraid of doing that. You compared them to tumbleweeds. I think this would greatly upset them and they wouldn't be able to handle it. So I think that it's just, so the problem with these kinds of ideas is that they just run one into the other. And I'm sure you run into this problem too, because you're like, well, they're very irresponsible, and this makes them very unmoored, and this turns them into like tumbleweeds, which makes them feel guilty, and then they get mad at conservatives for doing things properly. So it's like a big mushy mess, like someone trying to watercolor too loose, but
no. Well, so I'm getting a sense of your base philosophy, but you brought up feminism and then male feminists. So under kind of the aegis of community, well, God, church, the superstructure of God and church, and then humanity's somewhere there. But then there's men and women is the next step. Do you have a conception, or what is the conservative conception of male and female, and how does that square with modern times and the conditions that we have now?
I think the conservative view of the male and female relationship, and males and females independently, is greatly at odds with our modern culture, because the conservative view in this regard, it's very good that conservatives are just saying, no, this is not how it should be. I think it's very good that conservatives are supposed to say that marriage is one man and one woman, and it's permanent, and no fault divorces are not a thing. You must take responsibility. You've taken an oath in front of not just God at the church, but also in front of everyone in your family, your entire culture. So you have God, you have your culture, and you have your family. And then you also have the government. So in every conceivable way, like from every angle, you're trying to get this pressure on people to stay together for their family. And that's hugely culturally important. That's like lack of fathers is such an issue in the inner cities. It's a contributor to teen suicide. It's a contributor to poor performance in schools. The presence of a father will determine how much money you earn and whether you're present in your children's lives. And removing that responsibility from people is something that we massively misunderstand. We underestimate the importance of that. I think it was Heather Haying who said she feeds her family organic food because she doesn't think that you should mess with things that have been in place for a very long time that you don't understand. And I was so struck by that, because it appears to me that modern progressives are flagrantly trying to undo everything that has always worked for humans in the past for the sake of progress toward some unnamed end goal. I do not know what their end goal is. I am not convinced they have an end goal. And watching the war between the sexes is just proof of that to me, because feminists will never be satisfied. They just won't. There will always be something more to complain about. And I actually, to go back to your earlier point, I think that's probably one of the most attractive things about conservatism, is that you don't need to be discontent all the time. It's that you don't need to be on guard all the time, that there is forgiveness. We make constantly the comparison of leftist ideology as being a religion. And I noticed early on that there is no forgiveness. There is no redemption on the left. There's absolutely none. There's no hope, which is incredibly sad if you think about it. I genuinely feel bad for the people who actually believe these leftist tenets, because it's like, why would you want to be in a world, in a culture where there's no forgiveness, where the slightest mistake can get you canceled and unable to find work? What is the positive of that? I just don't see any. And conservatism has that. They have forgiveness, like they have acceptance, like we actively want gay people, and we're okay with trans people, and we are far more inclusive at this point than the so-called inclusive left. And I view that as being a huge positive for the right wing. I just wonder, how much is too much, but that's okay.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the tension, and it's an American tension. It's a puritanical tension. If you think of the Scarlet Letter, like you're advocating for a society where the Scarlet Letter would come back, right? Where somebody who commits adultery would be canceled. So there would be a cancellation policy in this culture.
Yeah, I do think so. And obviously that would need to be fleshed out better. In Lydia's perfect world, where Lydia is supreme dictator, there's enough cultural pressure that something like adultery is vanishingly rare. that it would not be even conceivable for you to look for that kind of thing outside your marriage, because you remember that that's what you agreed to. At the forefront, I know in our modern culture, it's easy to forget a lot of this stuff. But if you have a cultural pressure, you will constantly be reminded in a way that no government can ever enforce, in a way that you don't have to constantly think about it, because everyone around you is doing something similar. Not exactly the same thing, not in exactly the same way. Everyone's different. I got married when I was 22. Other people never get married, and that's fine too. But it's like, if you are married, then you need pressure from outside. You need the support, not just the negativity of the pressure and the judgment, but the positivity of the encouragement and the community and the friends who are doing the same things. So technically there would be a cancellation policy, but with Nathaniel Hawthorne in the Scarlet Letter, I don't recall the precise ending, but based on my Christian faith, Jesus with the woman at the well, he sat down and he talked to her. She was an adulteress, and he said, I think I'm mixing my stories. There was the case of the adulteress where they were bringing her out and they were going to stone her. And Jesus said to them, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." And I think that's such a wonderful, perfect picture of the kind of redemption and forgiveness that can be found. And he later went on to tell her, "Go and sin no more." So by saving her from this literal sure death, he was then in a position to have her emotions and her attention and say, "You need to never do this again. This needs to not be the case for you in any instance ever. But at least you'll be alive to not make the same mistake again." So I would go much more heavily with the Christian idea of forgiveness and redemption more than Nathaniel Hawthorne's cancellation policy.
So, what about the destiny of females then in this Lydia's world? The destiny of females is to be birthing people, right?
Oh, no. Well, okay, so given that we are literally the only people in the world who can birth, I think that's a pretty cool talent. I think that the fact that women are biologically structured, it's so interesting to me because this is so at odds with modern thinking in general. Women are designed to have children. I don't think that anyone can really argue in good faith that this is not the case. We have wide hips. So when I was in anatomy, we compared pelvises of the two different genders. And I was like, I told my teacher, I was like, these don't even look like they're from the same species. And he's like, yeah, men have narrower hips. They're designed to be able to run better than women. They have a different center of balance, center of gravity. Tim talks at length about how female skaters are never be as good as male skaters. And I'm like, okay, that's fair, that's fine. And it's because of the angle of their hips. And I'm like, okay. So women have wider hips. Women store body fat differently than men. Literally everything, every month, women are reminded of whether or not they're pregnant. And I'm like, what is it about us today that makes us think we are incredibly arrogant to be able to think, oh, you know what women are actually designed to do? Work in offices. Just like men. They're designed to do the same things that men do. They should be second-rate men. That's disgusting to me. It makes me really sad because women do amazing things. Women shape the hand that rocks the cradle rules, the hand that rocks the cradle rules a nation, or whatever that saying is. I think it's true because women are a huge source of culture, and they always have been. But now we're like, no, you know what you're going to do? You're going to be exactly like dudes. That's soul crushing. That's disappointing. And a lot of women my age are now saying, gosh, I wish I could be a housewife. I wish we could be a single income family. And I could just stay at home and raise my kids, and I want to have kids. And I'm like, well, now we can't because we doubled our workforce by adding women in, and now the cost of living has adjusted to such that if you want to live this fancy American life, you need to have two incomes. And all of this transpires to just make me kind of sad and disappointed because I think that men and women would be much happier I don't know what the depression rate for women is, but I do know that alcoholism, use of antidepressants, and all this other stuff for women has simply skyrocketed since our liberation happened. And that saddens me because women are special. They're designed to keep humanity going. And they've really kind of as a whole rejected that and said, we don't want this interesting and unique gift. We want to do what guys do. And that's just so hollow, you know? So that's kind of my view of what would make me happy.
So let's, I don't mean this offensively, but I want to put it into the context. Can you hear me? Did I freeze?
Yeah.
I want to put this in the context of, let's say, younger women who are looking up to you.
Yes.
And they might be hearing you say, go and have babies. But if they look at your life, you're a producer. You're in the workforce. Do you consider yourself a second-rate producer? Do you consider yourself like a man should be doing that job? Or is there something about your skill set and maybe even your femininity that makes you better at that job or uniquely qualified, let's say, at the job that you're doing?
That's a really interesting question. And this is definitely something I've thought about. And I've been speaking in very broad terms. I don't want people to feel that all women must have children. I know some women cannot have children. I know some women simply never want to have kids. And I don't think that someone who does not want to have children should have children, because that's just kind of a recipe for a horrible life for your kids and a horrible life for you. On an individual level, I think women should be able to do exactly what they want to do. And I do believe that this makes me a truer feminist than most feminists out there. I think women should be able to stay at home if they want to. I think there should be absolutely no cultural pressure against staying at home with your kids. For me, that's just the bottom line, because it's like, if you actually want women to do whatever they want, you need to be okay with the fact that probably a lot of them really just want to stay home and raise kids. And if that is the case, you need to be okay with that. And you need to support women who want to do that. As far as I'm concerned, my life has been strange because I've been in a supporting role for my spouse, who's been in school the entire time we've been married. So we haven't.
You must be like a super doctor by now or something,
yeah.
Like a doctor 3 times over.
He has a total of 6 degrees, including a doctorate. Yeah, 2 different master's degrees, 2 bachelors, 2 associates, 2 masters, 1 doctorate. And I told him that if he wants to get another doctorate, then he will be doing that on his own, because this is ridiculous. I'm like, the school is enough. I've really had enough. But he's finally achieved the doctorate, and he's wrapping up and coming back shortly. So that's my strange particular situation. And we did it that way because the cost of school in the U.S. is simply prohibitive. There was no way he was going to be able to have any kind of peace of mind with $300,000 worth of student loan hanging over his head. And that's it just should be what you want it to be. I will be having kids later than I wanted to, but I'm absolutely going to make it one of my top priorities. I want to provide my children with a home, and I want to make sure that they never have to go to a public school. Those are pretty much my goals in life at this point. So I will say, people have definitely described me as an empty egg carton because I am almost 30 and I don't have kids yet. That's typically far, far right who's calling me that, and it amuses me endlessly because I know that's not the case. But it's like, I know I haven't had kids yet, but as you say, like, there is a little bit of judgment there, because it's like, if I wanted to have 4 kids, I probably should have started when I was about 24 or 25, just to make sure that I'm around as long as possible for my kids. It's not what ended up happening. I think that my husband being a doctor will give my kids a great shot at life. So that's like kind of a balance that you got to make for yourself. But for me, my end goal is to be a stay-at-home mom. As far as production goes, I do think that a dude could do my job extremely well. I'm extremely grateful and I'm extremely happy to work with Tim, but I also know that I could be replaced at any time, which keeps me on my toes. I think that's how anybody in any job should be. I love working with Tim. I love the show. I love his end goal, and I think that it's really important for the culture. But if I were a man and I were doing my job and being the single income for my wife, I would think that would be more positive than me doing the job? I don't know. That's kind of hard to say, because I feel helpful and I feel really happy to pitch in a female voice on the show. And I feel like that's necessary. Otherwise, it's just a sausage fest. But it's like, I don't know. I don't really have a good answer for you. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I mean, I think it's just an interesting question because the qualities, and this is totally up for debate. And if you talk in general terms, some people will think you're being prescriptive rather than descriptive. But there's got to be something. At the beginning of this conversation, you said that Tim brought you in because a female is a draw. So it's not just the most crude way of reading that would be some sort of sex appeal, but but there's something beyond just sex connection that a woman brings to the space or the conversation that she enters into. One, it allows women who are watching to identify more with the show. It brings them in, and it might be the case that there's some sort of intimacy or some sort of connection that a female can facilitate that men don't necessarily facilitate as well. So it's just, and if we can explore that, or if we give props to that, then young women will know that it's okay to be a woman and to not try to be a man, but also know that their skills are valuable in these creative spaces, and they actually bring a lot to them.
I think you're right. I wouldn't even be in a position to say what I think about where women should be if I didn't have a position, first of all, afforded to me by a man and in a typically male field. So that is a great point as well. I do think that maybe in a perfect world, it's better to say not that every woman would be a stay-at-home mother, but that every woman would have the ability to do something that she really loves to do, like producing, while also being a mom and not feeling some incredible amount of pressure to be earning a bunch of money or to be in the rat race trying to be a CEO. Maybe it's better to say that the role a woman has in society should be fitted to what she's good at. And I do think that in some ways society already offers women that, because when they really tried to make the level, they really tried to level the playing field in Sweden. They said men and women can do exactly the same things, and you cannot discriminate against an applicant based on any kind of gender understanding. What happened with them, so interesting to me, I'll never forget. More women went into nursing and more men went into engineering. It became even more polarized because it turns out that women are good at nursing and teaching and men are good at engineering and science.
Well, it's not even that they're good at that. It's that they want to do that too.
Exactly. That is what they prefer. Women like people. Women really love to talk. I don't know if you've noticed that. Women really like to talk. So they have a totally different view of the world. Like I love, respect, and admire Tim, but I feel like my interpersonal skills are not on the same level as his. I feel like that is my forte. I feel like if I need to say something uncomfortable to someone, I feel that I am able to do that in a way that is very tactful. I feel like I am able to keep the peace, sometimes a little bit too much. Sometimes I go along a little too much to get along. But I feel that maintaining a relationship with someone is more important than telling them they've done something wrong. And I feel that if you can communicate in such a way as to let them know that they did something wrong without totally alienating them or making them feel like a piece of garbage, that's perfect. That's the perfect balance. Like, that's what you really, really want. And I think that women are much more, and I will say this with the understanding that people are incredibly unself-aware, I think that women have better emotional intelligence than men do. Whereas men have different strengths, they have better spatial reasoning, and they're better with
mechanical
mechanical
video
stuff.
games, maybe.
So the typical understanding is that women like people and men like things.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to me, too, because the highest paid position in nursing is anesthesiology, and it is completely dominated by men because you don't have to deal with the patient. The patient
becomes an object.
Exactly. The person becomes an object, and you're dealing with dosages, and you're dealing with monitoring and computers and stuff. So that was fascinating to me, too, because I was like, I heard people complaining about how there's literally a pay gap in nursing. even though something like 78% of nursing is women. And I was like, oh, it's because there is a part of nursing that turns the patients into objects, and that's where the men want to go. Amazing, right? And I'm like, it makes perfect sense. People just don't want to see it. They want to believe there's a wage gap because that gives them this boogeyman to fight against, I guess, because there's no end point to their progress. I don't know.
I don't know how to pivot into this because it's going back, and it's maybe we'll get it to tie into the gender thing. But you mentioned that you're worried about the tribalism, or maybe not worried, but you're concerned about the tribalism of the right. And from the, let's say, the center-left media propaganda, it's really powerful. I don't even know what to call that. The hegemony of CNN, etc. The right is put into this kind of this bucket where there's white nationalism and then a bunch of like grades of white nationalism. So with that in mind, what is your perspective on the tribalism of the right and how the right keeps that element in check or deals with it in a way where it's not dominant and it can't be dominant and it's basically gelded?
That is a really interesting question. I'm not sure how to stop it in its tracks. I do know where I see it because, who was it that commented this? Somebody made a comment. Oh, it was Will Chamberlain. He mentioned that he feels like Trump is washed up, that his time has come and gone. And the comments, I just scrolled through the comments and I was like, people will not let go of him. They are turning on Will because he holds this opinion that they don't think is correct. They're calling him a shill. They're calling him a sellout. They're calling him a loser. They're calling him all sorts of names because he holds a view that is different than theirs. I was genuinely disgusted by that because I was like, that's exactly what the left does. This is the tribalism we don't want. We want to be open to people's different ideas. You want to be confident enough and self-aware enough to be able to say, Will, I really like Donald Trump. I think you're wrong, but I understand where you're coming from. You know, for whatever reason, he's just not the draw that he used to be. He was, even if you do feel like he was the right person for the job at the time, you can at least entertain the idea that maybe it's time for somebody new. And I don't know how to combat that because I feel like that's a little bit a part of populism. I do feel that populism is making a comeback. It's having a bit of a resurgence. And I think that broadly speaking, populism is a positive thing, but I'm concerned that it will turn into this collectivism that is such a weakness for the left. Well, it's and a weakness.
Could you define, for the sake of conversation, what do you mean by populism?
I need to look up the actual definition because from my understanding, it is this general idea that the people who vote other people into power are where, hold on one second.
It's kind of like a kind of a jubilant status quo or some sort of active, like the active yeast of status quo-ness.
Yeah, possibly so. That's a good comparison. I want to get my real definition here because I believe firmly in working with strong definitions from the get-go.
Well, the definition is going to change just as soon as you announce it on the internet.
I know, it's true. Okay, let's see how they currently define it. A political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. I think that's perfect understanding of the people who voted for Trump.
So again, it's reactionary. It's got that discontentedness to it.
Yes, yeah. It's trying to curl the status quo, the deep state, all those boogeymen who ignore us and who we actually don't even elect.
So it's a counter status quo, but from the outsider perspective of like what is going on in our government that's supposed to represent us is not representing us anymore. So it's a agitated state. That agitation, that discontent that's another big vector of difficulty that I see the conservatives, especially with the way that the media apparatus is able to frame them as insurgents, just with that stupid 11/16 thing. Totally stupid. And I knew as soon as it happened that it was going to be used Go be
idea.
used. It's like the just handing them on a silver platter exactly what they want.
Oh, I was so mad. I was like, why are we doing this? This is the worst idea in the history of ideas. You know how bad this looks? But at the same time, I understood how upset people were. I was like, I totally get it. Like, and in retrospect, it very much to me just looks like, I call it the walking tour, because they were like ushered in and they were kind of welcomed, and a lot of them were a little too rowdy, and obviously they're having the whole book thrown at them. But it's like, I understand some of that frustration. Like, if you start to feel that your vote doesn't count, what are you supposed to do? I mean, at least they weren't just sitting around complaining about it, but at the same time, they have to know how bad that looks. Like,
you remember when Trump got elected, there's this meme of people going, that one person, and going, you know, that meme? Like, that 1-6 is going to be the same thing, but because the left can't meme, it's going to be used as a cudgel.
Right.
Not to mock conservatives, but to castigate conservatives. So, but that aside, the discontent is a problem that needs to be dealt with or channeled correctly. Trump might have been a little too loose on the wheel for that. It has to be harnessed, but really channeled towards the right, constructive behavior. And I think that we see that in the school board meetings. That's the other, like, a municipal level, not rebellion, but check on the government. I think that going to the municipality actually gets back into the roots, the Tocquevillian roots of America, where we started as small little groups that were connected to states that were then federated. So there's this more responsibility for the narrative that actually affects your children, that is human-sized, that's run by people that you know or could know or run into at dinner. That is the proper place to channel discontent, because you can actually get something done. And then you avoid the entire media apparatus narrative, which exists on such a low resolution level, from Tucker to CNN, to Don Lemon. They're both operating on this really high level that I don't think most people are conditioned, or we're not supposed to work on that level. We're supposed to work on an interpersonal level.
Absolutely.
That's some thoughts there on that.
I think you're right. And this has kind of troubled me for quite a while. This is something that we talk about when people ask, what can we do? You know, there's nothing we can do. I'm like, you're looking at the presidency. You should be looking at your school board. You should be looking at your AG. You should be looking at places where you can get involved in your own community. We have so atomized that we don't even think about our communities anymore. We don't think about our churches. We don't think about the schools that our kids go to. We take it all for granted, and we only look at the presidency. And what we've been telling people is to get involved on the interpersonal level, to go and make your voice heard. My mom was in charge of the caucuses in Colorado for our district. Like, people don't even think about their district. They don't even know who's in their district. They don't know about the politicians who affect their everyday lives. They're only looking at Joe Biden. They're only looking at their representatives in Congress. And I see that as being a huge issue, because it makes people feel powerless. And I think that's led to this rise in populism, because people look at too great scale and they think, well, there's absolutely nothing I can do here. And you, on some level, you are correct when you say that there's nothing I can do. My vote didn't make any difference to who got elected this last time. It didn't make any difference who got elected in 2016. But, you know, what would make a difference would be me looking around at the people in charge of our schools. For example, if I had kids in charge of managing our roads, our mayors, stuff like that, that's a place where you can make a difference. So I think you're 100% on the money there. And I think that would help people feel a greater sense of empowerment
and belonging.
Exactly.
They'd be tied to their actual community. That would be the other side of the church. Have a church, but also be municipally active.
100%.
Be a civilian. Be engaged in civics.
Right. Being a responsible citizen implies working with the people in your community, the people who live next to you. And that would get us back to being in a position where we can say, well, I disagree with you on everything, but at least we can agree that the people in the schools teaching our kids should not be teaching them critical race theory. That's just That's all we have to have in common. And then maybe we can go out and get coffee some other time and talk about the weather or sports or whatever. And that would kind of get us back to having a real community and not being so extremely online as we have been. And I think that would really be a net positive. So yeah, I think that by taking action, people could really transform. But see, that's the issue, is that people look too big, and being on the interpersonal level, the municipal level, is hard work.
Mm-hmm.
It requires,
it's boring.
It is
long,
boring.
Boring meetings, listening to voice after voice. And and usually just a sampling of normal people, which is like half or below average. So you have to really be patient and kind and practice like humanitarian values.
That's
actually.
True.
And once you practice those, you can actually gain them. Maybe, you fake it till you make it.
Exactly. Well, you won't be outraged. And I wonder if we can bounce back to this working with one another on this basic level and get away from constantly being outraged by what Kamala Harris did or by what Donald Trump did. It's going to be a lot less exciting, and people will probably kind of withdraw. Like, it'll be challenging for people, but it's what needs to happen, 100%. And I'm so glad to see it happening in school boards.
Yeah, I wonder if that kind of, I don't know, Portland and Seattle, where I'm from, we are so screwed. We are so screwed. So it's going to be a social experiment, and basically corporate communism is where we're headed with all this equity stuff in schools. And then the way that they deal with riots. And I don't know if that was just to get Trump out of it. Seemed like the Democratic mayors last year were allowing that to happen because they were told upstream to let that go on, to try to get Trump to do something that then they could show him to be the Nazi that they always promised he would be, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know to what extent it was a game, but it was also, I don't know if you know my origin story with the Evergreen State College. You have the same progressive pattern of the structure teaching the students that all structures are oppressive, and then the students do an uprising, and then the head of the structure proves himself to be a weak beta leader, which is the same thing that happened in Seattle and in Portland. They just let these people take over, and that disenfranchises that. I'm just trying to make the leap between civic-mindedness and then holding people responsible when they start to riot, when they start to act in the name of this huge global movement, which is a problem. We're going to end capitalism. We're going to end racism, right? They're doing this huge universal fight, these young people, which allows them to depersonalize and destroy and not be connected to anything in such a way that they can just wreak havoc and act on that level. And so they're justified in that way. If we can practice that and then raise the young with a sense of place and a sense of immediacy rather than urgency, like rather deal with your immediate surroundings rather than this urgent social issue that might, trend away from that Civil War end game that constant agitation will preclude.
I think this is why Jordan Peterson says to clean your room. And I think that he brings it down to the absolute baseline, like even beyond your municipal location, your actual physical surroundings. He also says to take one place and just make it as beautiful as you can. That's what I'm trying to do with my patio right now. People just kind of assume I'm just doing things, but the reason I like memes is because it's a cultural heartbeat. The reason I go to the pool is because I want to be more self-esteem. The reason that I work on my patio is because I want to make this really beautiful place that's like really transcendent. And for me, it's my patio because I also happen to love plants. But it's like, if you don't take control, I think this is why Jordan Peterson is probably one of the most important voices right now. It's because he's talking about taking responsibility for yourself. That's where you have to start. And as far as I can tell, taking responsibility for your own family and focusing on your own community is the only way forward, because we can't be focusing on the whole world. This globalist movement is too much for us. Humans have never been able to, or they've never had to deal with the entire world. Mm-hmm. Greta Thunberg, she's literally having panic attacks. She has a hard time. She can't sleep. She can't eat because she's constantly worried about the whole world. So instead of going home and doing what she can in her own community, she makes it everyone else's problem and tries to make everyone feel guilty, and then they try to ram through these power grabs. So I don't think there is an upside to looking at the whole picture all the time. It's not what humans have ever done before, and I don't think it's good for us now.
Yeah, that's a perfect Ouroboros, because that's where you started with. People need to think philosophically, which is the opposite of what you're saying now, but it's also in tune with what you're saying now. There's a tension between thinking universally, but thinking philosophically universally, or
Yes.
So
I think that philosophy, so I do think that people must think philosophically, because if you wish to be responsible and to do the right things in your own community, then you need to understand yourself, and you need to know that you need to be responsible for yourself and responsible for your community. So I think that philosophy is fundamental. See, I've never thought of philosophy as being like this global idea. I've always thought of it as being very personal and very important to the way that you personally view the rest of the world. So maybe I feel like I'm being consistent because I think that philosophy is such a personal thing that everyone would be better off for figuring out what they themselves actually believe, that would help them be better, more understanding of themselves as well. So
there's I've been doing a lot of work on mapping and investigating through interview feminist thought, and there is a feminism that's kind of on the rise, or like there's ideas around a non-liberal feminism or non-liberation feminism that's trying to deal with just the bare bone facts that women produce children, and by that very act, the liberal subject, or the thought that we are free to be ourselves, is destroyed because there's that symbiotic relationship on such a primal level that's not taken into account with liberal thinking. So there is a conservative feminist thought that I think is open. It's a promising vector of investigation for me, and I think that you're somehow, just listening to today, you're somehow like giving me a better understanding of conservatism and how a woman can embrace that and implement that. Because in the feminist narrative, or in just the modern narrative, the conception of conservatism is anti-female from the liberal standpoint. But there's this other side to it that's not being seen when that is the picture.
So reductive, because to view any political stance as being anti-gender, like an entire movement being completely against a whole gender, that is so, I think that's just kind of reductive thinking, because conservatism is so much more. It touches on literally every single aspect of life. Who are some of the other thinkers who are like conservative feminism in your mind?
Well, I'm posting an interview right now. These are unknowns, but they're rising stars, with Mary Harrington and Alex Kashuta. Alex Kashuta is Eastern European, and Mary Harrington is British. I think, is that the right term? She's in the UK, and she has that accent. But she does a lot of writing, and she's actually one of the best writers that I've come across in the current time, just the way that she thinks and the way that she's attacking things. So those two, but they're kind of relatively unknown. I think that there's a lot of things that haven't actually been mapped out on what it is to have a non-liberal vision as a woman of womanhood, and what does that really entail? And that talking about representation, that has not been really well represented in the culture. Especially non-Christian culture outside of the right, and just kind of the mainstream, kind of the centrist, kind of, just the marketplace of ideas. That stuff hasn't really been mapped out.
That's great. That's really exciting. I'm going to have to look into these ladies. I actually did have a question for you, knowing that you're over there on the West Coast. East Coast. I'm on the East Coast. You're on the West Coast. What makes you want to stay in these cities if you feel like everything's gone down the drain so badly? Because we've been counseling people to leave cities, but I have friends in Minneapolis, and I'm like, I feel like if you believe that you can make a difference there, that you'll probably want to stay. And that makes sense to me if you have your life there. I really didn't want to leave Colorado until I finally had a chance. But what motivates you to stick around?
What motivates me to be unmotivated to move, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, one, I don't live inside of the city. I live embedded in nature, and I work locally. My day job gets me in contact with the locals, so I have a sense of place and a sense of ownership. And yeah, so I'm kind of embedded in a way in the larger culture, but I kind of just do my own thing. It's always ironic that people like you and me are constantly counseling people to be less online, but we are super duper.
Yeah, lines do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's true. No,
So
it is ironic.
I'm ironically or hypocritically in a position to speak impersonally about being personal, and to be a recluse that's speaking about a different way of being communal. And I try to model that in the way that I speak with people online or the interviews and stuff like that, so that my community isn't local. Like I'm kind of embedded, but I do this global thing. So that was kind of like one of the questions. It's probably more of a Tim Pool question rather than your question, but you're dealing at such a high level of attention, right? He's got a million subs.
He's got a million subs on each channel. Yeah.
On each channel. Every video gets at least 200 to 400,000. Anyway, so.
Yeah, each episode for sure.
The platform is huge. How do you keep that personal? How do you keep grounded? And how do you keep that from not turning you into something that's impersonal and influencer-like or unreal or like an icon, rather? Words. That's just the question that I have generally.
Yeah. With him, I think he's the right kind of person to be famous because it doesn't scare him, and it also doesn't negatively affect him and make him more willing to be provocative or loud or whatever. He's the personality type that it's like nothing is going to change him, which is actually, even though it can be frustrating to have someone who's stubborn like that. At the same time, at the end of the day that that's what you want, because you want someone who is not going to change on a whim, at the drop of a hat, because someone else told them to. That's the kind of steadfastness we really want. And I think that his position is one that allows him to channel his natural stubbornness to be kind of a voice for people who feel unheard. And because he does try to stay very much in the center, he gives a kind of platform to people who don't have this binary Republican or Democrat stance, which is a huge majority of people, I think, who don't fall into the typical two-party system. So I think he just kind of lives his life and does his own thing. He's very independent, free-spirited, and stubborn. And I think that's the right combination for someone in a position of influence and keeps him from turning into your typical H3H3 type podcaster.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You asked me not to talk about workplace drama, so you can totally not talk about this. But I just want to know if you want to say, what was the craziest episode, just the wildest time you've had?
Oh my gosh, that would have to be Alex Jones. 100%. The first and second time. He's like a barely controlled loose cannon. He's exactly the same off camera as he is on camera. I don't know if he's been that persona for so long, it's kind of bled over into his personal attitudes, but he is crazy intense and a lot of fun, but very, very intense. And Tim was like, whoa, calm down, like for the whole episode. And I was like, yeah, I can't do anything here. I don't know what to tell you.
So you were just helpless. You were caught up in the Jones whirlwind. Oh, wow.
Yeah, we were being thrown down the river. It was very exciting, but it was a lot of fun. It was just chaotic.
Well, and on the flip side of that, what's an episode or a guest that really opened your heart or was really hit home? Like,
we actually had Yeonmi Park on Friday. She is a defector from North Korea. And she talked about how they did not have the concept of love. And they had never seen trash cans before because they literally did not throw anything away. And I was like, oh, wow, we have so much to be grateful for. Really, anyone who can show and teach me to be grateful is very much appreciated because we're so lucky. Like, we live at the peak of human civilization. We have untold wealth that we never even fully grasp. And we need to be reminded sometimes. And she was the most recent and the most poignant example of that, for sure. She's very, very sweet lady, and she's making a huge difference in the world by having been so terribly mistreated in North Korea. So I was very profoundly moved, and I think that a lot of people were during that episode, because she's such a just matter of fact. She'll tell you, I was beaten, I was human trafficked, I went from here to here, we went across the Mongolian desert, and it's like, that's insane. How did all this happen? You're an incredible person. And she's also like, just matter of fact. I'm like kind of blown away by that. So yeah.
I had a pithy saying, but your heartfelt story distracted me from it.
Little birdie, I know.
I had a perfect question, like the wrap up question, but it got lost. Oh, I'm so sorry.
My husband describes me as a non-linear thinker, and I think that's a fair analysis.
A polylinear. You have all these threads. You're a weaver. You're a tapestry maker.
Yeah. And I'm always looking for the different threads, but it tends to get confusing because I will get distracted by different threads. So yeah. I think that writing would probably help me with that.
You're probably super busy. You're working on a patio right now, but do you have any glimmers of a product of your own, or something that's kind of percolating in the back of your head that you want to produce for people?
I thought so. I used to do these, I used to call them my little tea chats, where I'd come home after work and I would, while I was waiting for my hot water to warm up, I would do a little Instagram live stream where I would just talk about what I was thinking about during the show. That was a lot of fun. As I say, I don't think I could talk for 2 hours straight, although I don't know. I've just talked for like an hour without pretty much stopping. But I did think it would be really fun to do a podcast, because I do love listening to what other people have to say. So maybe if I were to like set something up with some of these other conservative feminists with whom I have maybe even just a little bit in common, that could be some really good conversation. But that's kind of where I'm at right now. I'd also like to write. I've always really liked to write. That's where I thought I would end up with
op-eds, short stories, fan fiction.
No, I don't. I don't really do fiction, but I do like to write about what I think about. And I think Andrew Klavan often uses the quote, "To write well is to think clearly," and that's why it's so hard. I think that if people really want to clarify their thoughts, that they need to write. And I think that people who are good at speaking are also very good at writing. Andrew Klavan is certainly an example of that. So maybe writing, maybe podcasting, but nothing right now. I'm along for the ride, and I'm loving seeing where the company is going, and I'm here for all that stuff. So, yeah.
Is there anything on the horizon with regards to your night job at Tim Pool's studios, or something coming up that you'd like to plug? Or?
Not at the moment. We have great guests all this week. Tomorrow, I think it is, we have Candace Owens.
Wow.
Yeah, so we've got some big names, but I was telling Tim, I really like having these big names, but I also really like bringing in people that are lesser known, people who don't really have that platform. So I think that both of those guests are equally interesting and equally important. So we have a great mix of really high profile and really underrated, underappreciated guests this week. So I'm stoked. It's going to be fun.
Excellent. Well, this was excellent. I'm going to do the cheesy podcast outro. Thank you so much, Lydia. I will link, I guess, your Twitter handle, maybe your Instagram too. All Twitter's relevant links down in the description.
Everybody can kind of follow along with my life on my Instagram. It's nothing terribly exciting, but I really like to engage with people through memes and through kind of pictures of what I'm doing, like my patios over there. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Ben. I really had a great time talking to you.
Yeah, it was good. It was nice to get more insight into who you are.
Yes, I'm happy to be here.
Congratulations for reaching the end of the discussion. If you enjoyed it, do be sure to leave a review or a comment or a thumbs up or whatever you need to do to show that glorious algorithm that this is some good stuff. And do be sure to go and check that back catalog, as it is brimming full of fantastic conversations. Links to provide monetary support are down there in the description as well. Have a good night.